5 days now. Her children needs her. We miss her. We love her.
Elaine, what has your experience with him been like previously? Is this...
Every homicide investigation begins with a question. Sometimes it's who, sometimes it's how. But in the most disturbing cases, investigators are forced to ask something far more painful. Who already knew this was going to happen? Because occasionally, the warning signs aren't hidden. They're spoken out loud, they're reported, they're documented. And despite all of that, someone still dies. Tonight's case isn't simply about a husband accused of murdering his wife. It's about deception so carefully constructed that two women unknowingly became part of the same life. It's about an ex-girlfriend who believed telling the truth would protect another woman, only to become the next person allegedly marked for death. It's about a man who had already spent decades proving what he was capable of, yet somehow convinced an entirely new community he had changed. This is the story of Shakira Rucker, Angel Milligan, and Corey Hill. And by the end, investigators would uncover a trail of violence stretching back more than 30 years. Welcome to Crime Autopsy. If you're fascinated by the psychology behind real criminal investigations, forensic evidence, and the hidden details many documentaries overlook, consider subscribing. Every week, we examine the evidence piece by piece, not speculation, not rumor, just the facts and the behaviors that shaped these tragic cases. Because sometimes, understanding why can be just as important as knowing what happened. At first glance, Corey Hill looked like someone whose darkest days were far behind him. To neighbors, he appeared hard-working. To members of his church, he projected faith, discipline, and redemption. He operated an electrical business. He dressed professionally. He smiled for photographs. Online, he posted affectionate messages celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays with his wife. Nothing about those carefully curated images suggested a man investigators would later accuse of planning a murder. But experienced homicide detectives know something that social media rarely reveals. The most dangerous lies are often the ones that require the most maintenance, because living two separate lives isn't just difficult, it's exhausting. Every conversation has to be remembered. Every excuse must remain believable. Every absence needs an explanation. One mistake, and the entire illusion collapses. According to investigators, Corey Hill had spent months managing exactly that kind of illusion. 2 relationships, 2 households, 2 women who had never met, neither realizing they were sharing the same man. One was his wife, the other believed she was building a future with him. Neither understood that both were living inside a carefully manufactured story. And stories built on deception rarely survive the truth. Long before police tapes surrounded a Florida storage facility, before search parties combed through wooded areas, before detectives began reviewing surveillance footage frame by frame, there was simply Shakira. Friends didn't describe her through accomplishments or wealth. They described consistency. She braided hair. She worked hard. She cared deeply about her children. Church wasn't just somewhere she attended. It was part of the rhythm of her life. Those closest to her repeatedly told reporters that she wasn't someone searching for excitement or drama. She wanted stability, a peaceful home, a future for her family. Clients who spent hours sitting in her salon chair often left feeling they'd gained more than a hairstyle. They had gained someone who listened, someone patient, someone kind. In many ways, Shakira represented exactly the kind of ordinary life violent offenders often seek to attach themselves to. Not because they value peace, but because they know peaceful people are often trusting. Meanwhile, less than an hour away, another woman believed she was in a committed relationship with the very same man. Angel Milligan had no idea there was another household. She knew the explanations, the work trips, the changing schedules, the missed evenings, the reasons he couldn't always be present. Each excuse seemed believable on its own. That's one of the most overlooked realities in cases involving long-term deception. People rarely uncover lies because of one enormous mistake. They uncover them because hundreds of tiny inconsistencies finally become impossible to ignore. And eventually, that's exactly what happened. Somewhere during 2023, the truth surfaced. Public court records never fully explain precisely how Angel discovered Corey's marriage. But investigators would later establish what happened next. Instead of confronting him first, she contacted his wife. Woman to woman. No manipulation, no revenge, no public spectacle, just the truth. Imagine receiving that phone call. Everything you believed about your marriage, suddenly questioned within minutes. Promises, plans, trust, all rewritten by a stranger. Yet according to investigators, that single conversation accomplished something months of deception never could. It exposed the double life. Instantly. Completely. There would be no carefully prepared explanation. No gradual damage control. The secret was over. And for a man who had invested months constructing two separate realities, that collapse would become a turning point. Not toward accountability, but toward escalation. Behavioral analysts who study intimate partner violence have long observed a troubling pattern. Many abusive individuals can tolerate conflict. They can tolerate arguments. Sometimes they can even tolerate separation. But exposure, being publicly unmasked, is often experienced as something entirely different. It isn't merely embarrassment. It's a perceived loss of control. And for offenders whose identities depend on controlling how others see them, that loss can trigger increasingly dangerous behavior. Investigators believe that after the affair was exposed, Corey Hill didn't simply lose a relationship. He lost the carefully crafted identity that allowed two completely separate lives to exist. The consequences began almost immediately. His wife forced him out of the home, the relationship fractured, the illusion ended, but another emotion had begun taking its place. Resentment, not toward the lies themselves, but toward the woman who revealed them. According to court records, Angel later sought legal protection after alleged threats made against her. She believed the danger was real. In hindsight, that decision may have saved her life. Because what investigators would later allege is chilling. The woman who exposed the deception would soon become the next target. And before anyone realized how serious that danger truly was, another woman would disappear without a trace. Every successful deception depends on one thing: not intelligence, not luck, but credibility. Because once people believe you're a good person, they begin explaining away the things that don't make sense. The missed phone calls become business. The late nights become overtime. The disappearing weekends become work trips. And eventually, the lie starts protecting itself. That's exactly what investigators believe happened in Corey Hill's life. By late 2023, he had built more than an electrical business. He had built a reputation, one that would make the truth almost impossible for people around him to imagine. To many people in Central Florida, Corey Hill wasn't known as a violent man. He introduced himself as Ambassador Corey. He spoke openly about faith. He attended church. He portrayed himself as someone who had overcome adversity and found purpose. On social media, his posts reflected the image of a devoted husband. Birthdays, holiday dinners, romantic captions, photographs embracing Shakira, Valentine's Day tributes, words like, "my queen," "the wind beneath my wings," "my rib." Looking back now, those posts feel almost surreal. Not because couples don't celebrate each other online, but because investigators believe some of those affectionate messages were posted while his marriage was already unraveling behind closed doors. It's a contradiction criminologists see surprisingly often. The public display of affection isn't always evidence of a healthy relationship. Sometimes, it's evidence that someone is carefully managing how others perceive them. The audience isn't always the spouse. Sometimes, it's everyone else. Friends later described Shakira as someone trying to rebuild her life. After learning about the affair, she reportedly made a decision that many victims of betrayal eventually make. She left. She asked Corey to move out. She found another place to live with her children. It wasn't easy. Starting over rarely is. Finding affordable housing, managing bills, maintaining stability for 4 children, continuing to work, keeping life as normal as possible. None of that happens overnight. Yet by all accounts, she was trying. One day at a time, one decision at a time. For many outside observers, that should have been the end of the story. A marriage ends. 2 people move on. Life continues. But investigators would later argue that Corey wasn't ready to let go. Not because he couldn't accept losing the relationship, but because he couldn't accept losing control over it. Behavioral experts who study domestic violence often distinguish between ordinary relationship conflict and coercive control. Arguments happen in many relationships. Control is different. Control is about ownership. It's about deciding who the other person can see, where they can go, when conversations begin, when they end. And perhaps most importantly, whether the relationship itself is allowed to end. Research has consistently shown that the period immediately after separation is among the most dangerous times for victims of intimate partner violence. Not because every separation becomes violent, far from it, but because separation removes something abusive individuals often depend upon: access. Once that access disappears, some offenders attempt to regain it through persuasion, others through manipulation, and a small but dangerous number through violence. Investigators believe this case followed that final pattern. Weeks passed. Life appeared to settle. Shakira focused on her children, her work, her future. Meanwhile, Corey continued projecting normalcy online. Nothing suggested the tragedy investigators say was already taking shape. Then something unexpected happened. The 2 agreed to meet. Public records don't clearly explain who initiated the conversation. Perhaps it was an attempt to achieve closure. Perhaps practical matters still needed to be discussed. Perhaps one believed reconciliation remained possible. No one outside those 2 people knows for certain. What investigators do know is that they met, and that decision would become the final chapter of Shakira's life. In the days leading up to their meeting, Corey made several changes to his Facebook profile. At first glance, they seemed ordinary. A new profile picture, a new cover photo, more photographs together, romantic captions celebrating their marriage. If someone unfamiliar with the situation had seen those posts, they might have assumed the couple was happier than ever. But investigators would later examine those same posts through an entirely different lens. Were they genuine expressions of affection, or were they an attempt to establish a public narrative, one that suggested everything between them was perfectly normal? Digital investigators frequently analyze social media timelines because posts don't merely show what happened. They sometimes reveal what someone wanted other people to believe. That distinction can become critically important, especially when those online images no longer match real life. November 11th, 2023. The couple met for dinner at the Hungry Crab restaurant in Davenport, Florida. Security cameras quietly documented their arrival, like thousands of surveillance cameras across America do every single day. No dramatic music, no warning, just another evening, another table, another couple sharing a meal. To everyone else inside the restaurant, nothing appeared unusual. But for investigators reviewing that footage later, every frame became evidence. Family members who later viewed the video noticed something they couldn't forget. They said Shakira didn't seem like herself. She wasn't smiling. Her body language appeared restrained. Whether she felt uneasy, whether she sensed danger, or whether she was simply tired, no one can say with certainty. Surveillance footage records movements, not thoughts. But that recording would become the last confirmed public sighting of Shakira alive. According to Corey Hill's account, dinner ended peacefully. He claimed he drove Shakira back toward her apartment complex and dropped her off near the mailboxes before leaving. On its surface, the explanation sounded simple. Too simple. Because investigators immediately encountered one enormous problem. There was no evidence she ever returned home. Her children never saw her. Friends never heard from her again. The routine that had defined her life suddenly stopped. No appointments, no work, no ordinary conversations. For someone described as deeply devoted to her family, the silence was profoundly out of character. Families often notice these changes long before law enforcement does. They know routines, they recognize habits, they understand what is normal. And they knew this wasn't. Within hours, concern began turning into fear. Calls went unanswered. Messages remained unread. The woman who had spent years caring for everyone else had seemingly vanished, without explanation, without a trace. But while loved ones searched desperately for answers, investigators would later discover that another surveillance camera had quietly recorded something far more significant than the dinner. A recording that would transform a missing person investigation into a homicide case. One camera, one storage facility, two people walking inside, only one ever walking back out. In homicide investigations, there is a moment detectives often describe as the point of no return. It's the instant when a missing person case stops being about finding someone alive and becomes about proving exactly how they died. Sometimes that moment arrives because a witness comes forward. Sometimes because forensic evidence tells a different story. And sometimes it's because a surveillance camera records something no one notices until days later. For investigators, November 12, 2023 would become that moment. By sunrise the following morning, Shakira Rucker was still missing. To her family, that alone was alarming. This wasn't someone who disappeared without telling anyone. She was a mother. Her children depended on her. She had responsibilities, clients waiting for appointments, a routine that rarely changed. When she didn't come home, those closest to her knew something was terribly wrong. Yet they still had reason to hope. Perhaps her phone battery had died. Perhaps she had stayed with a friend. Perhaps something unexpected had delayed her. Hope often survives long after logic begins to fade. Unknown to her family, another set of cameras had already recorded the final known moments of her life. The location wasn't a parking lot. It wasn't a gas station. It wasn't her apartment complex. It was a storage facility in Apopka, Florida. Security footage later reviewed by investigators allegedly showed Corey Hill arriving with Shakira. The two walked together toward one particular storage unit. From a distance, it looked completely ordinary. No visible struggle. No obvious panic. Just two adults entering a rented unit. But then came the image investigators would replay countless times. Minutes later, Corey Hill emerged, alone. The cameras never captured Shakira leaving, not seconds later, not minutes later, not hours later, never. For detectives, surveillance footage doesn't automatically prove murder, but it does establish something equally important: opportunity. And from that moment forward, Corey Hill's timeline began colliding with the evidence. Sometime around that same morning, a text message was sent from Shakira's phone to one of her daughters. "I'm on my way home with food." At first glance, it sounded reassuring. Exactly the kind of message a mother would send. But there was one devastating problem. She never arrived. Investigators would later argue that by the time the message was sent, Shakira may already have been dead. Digital evidence has become one of the most powerful tools in modern homicide investigations. Phones continue generating data even after someone is no longer able to use them. Location information, message timestamps, cell tower connections, application activity. Each piece forms part of a much larger puzzle. Detectives would later examine whether that text reflected communication or concealment, because delaying concern by even a few hours can give an offender valuable time. Time to clean, time to move evidence, time to build an explanation, time to disappear. But according to investigators, Corey Hill wasn't finished, not even close. Just hours after Shakira vanished, they allege he drove toward another destination, a home belonging to Angel Milligan, the woman whose phone call had exposed his double life. It had been weeks since she warned Shakira, weeks since she sought legal protection against him. On paper, a court order prohibited Corey from contacting or approaching her. In reality, paper has never stopped someone determined to commit violence. According to investigators, Corey arrived at the property carrying a firearm. He didn't come to talk. He allegedly came looking for Angel. The details that followed remain deeply disturbing. As Angel realized who had arrived, she turned and ran toward the safety of her house. Investigators say gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the property. Rounds struck the home while children were inside. Angel later described hearing shots close enough to feel them passing nearby. Against overwhelming odds, she survived. So did her children, had events unfolded only slightly differently. Investigators may have been investigating multiple homicides that same day. Behavioral analysts often refer to this kind of violence as retaliatory targeting. When someone who exposes abuse becomes the focus of escalating aggression, the motive isn't random, it's punishment. The offender blames the person who revealed the truth rather than confronting the consequences of their own actions. That pattern appears repeatedly in domestic violence research. The violence expands beyond the intimate partner, friends, family members, witnesses. Anyone perceived as interfering can suddenly become part of the offender's target list. Investigators believe Angel became exactly that, not because of what she had done wrong, but because she had told the truth. The alleged shooting triggered an immediate law enforcement response. Deputies quickly identified Corey Hill as the suspect. A search began. It didn't last long. Authorities located and arrested him near Mount Dora later that day. He was booked into the Orange County Jail on multiple charges related to the shooting, including attempted murder and other serious offences. From an investigative standpoint, it appeared they had stopped a violent offender before anyone else could be harmed. But there was one heartbreaking reality investigators still didn't understand. The woman at the centre of the entire case was still missing. While Corey sat behind bars, Shakira's family had no idea where she was. They searched neighbourhoods, wooded areas, roadways, anywhere hope still existed. Volunteers joined them. Friends handed out flyers. Relatives pleaded with the public for information. Every passing day made the silence heavier. For parents, children, siblings. The unknown can sometimes feel even more unbearable than the truth, because without answers, every possibility remains alive. Investigators, meanwhile, worked to reconstruct Corey Hill's recent movements. Where had he been? What vehicles had he used? Who had seen him? Were there surveillance cameras, rental agreements, phone records, financial transactions? Every homicide investigation begins by assembling thousands of tiny fragments. Most lead nowhere. A few become everything. One detail provided by Shakira's family would soon prove especially important. A relative mentioned that Corey didn't appear to keep many belongings at his residence. It raised a simple but significant possibility. If he wasn't storing his property at home, where was he storing it? Storage facilities. There were hundreds across central Florida. Finding the correct one would require time. And time was exactly what investigators didn't have. Because somewhere, hidden behind an ordinary metal door, the answer had already begun revealing itself. Not through surveillance cameras, not through witnesses, but through something impossible to ignore. A strange odour, a dark reddish liquid slowly creeping beneath the wall into the neighbouring storage unit. A leak that one concerned renter refused to dismiss. That single observation would soon expose a crime investigators were still desperately trying to solve. Every killer hopes time will become an accomplice. The longer a victim remains missing, the colder the trail becomes. Memories fade, evidence disappears, witnesses move on, and investigators are forced to rebuild a crime from fragments. But sometimes, it's not sophisticated forensic technology that breaks a case. Sometimes, it's an ordinary citizen who notices that something simply isn't right. In this investigation, the breakthrough didn't come from a confession. It didn't come from surveillance footage. It came from a neighbouring renter who trusted his instincts. Several days had passed since Shakira Rucker disappeared. Outside, her family continued organising search parties. Flyers covered community bulletin boards. Local news stations carried emotional interviews. Her mother pleaded for information. Her children waited for a phone call that never came. Investigators were still treating the case as an active missing person investigation. They knew Corey Hill's account didn't fit the available evidence, but proving someone had been murdered and proving where are two very different challenges. Then, nearly a week after Shakira vanished, something unusual happened inside the storage facility. A man renting the unit next door noticed a dark reddish liquid seeping beneath the shared wall into his own storage space. At first, he tried to make sense of it. Maybe a leaking container, maybe rust-coloured water, maybe spoiled food left inside a refrigerator. The explanation didn't seem obvious, but the smell. The smell grew worse every day. Anyone who has worked around decomposition knows it isn't something easily forgotten. It lingers, it spreads, and it becomes impossible to ignore. Concerned, the neighbouring renter notified the facility staff. According to investigative records, employees initially believed it might simply be an oil leak or another maintenance issue. It was a reasonable assumption. Storage facilities occasionally deal with leaking containers or damaged equipment. But the odour kept intensifying. The liquid continued appearing beneath the dividing wall. The situation no longer resembled an ordinary maintenance problem. It resembled something far more serious. Unable to dismiss what she was seeing, the facility manager made a decision that would change the investigation forever. She cut the lock from the unit, slowly lifted the door, looked inside, and immediately stepped back. She called 911. The words spoken during that emergency call remain haunting. She reported that there appeared to be a body inside the storage unit. From where she stood, she could see what appeared to be a human head. Within minutes, deputies and crime scene investigators flooded the property. The missing person investigation had become a homicide investigation. Inside the storage unit, investigators located the body of Shakira Rucker. For 6 agonizing days, her family had searched neighborhoods, wooded areas, and empty fields. The answer had been hidden behind a locked metal door, just miles away. Crime scene technicians immediately began documenting everything, every inch of the unit, every stain, every object, every potential fingerprint, every biological sample. Unlike television dramas, real forensic investigations move deliberately. Nothing is rushed. Photographs are taken before anything is touched. Measurements are recorded. Evidence is packaged individually to prevent contamination. The goal isn't simply discovering what happened, it's preserving every fact so that months, or even years later, a jury can understand exactly what investigators found. In homicide cases, the crime scene becomes a silent witness, and if preserved correctly, it tells a remarkably detailed story. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, a disturbing picture emerged. Surveillance footage showed Corey Hill entering the storage unit with Shakira. The cameras captured only him leaving. Hours later, investigators allege he drove to Angel Milligan's home and opened fire. Meanwhile, text messages sent from Shakira's phone suggested someone had attempted to create the illusion that she was still alive. Each piece of evidence, viewed independently, raised questions. Together, they formed a pattern. Behavioral analysts often emphasize that premeditated violence rarely consists of one isolated decision. Instead, it unfolds through preparation, planning, transportation, concealment, attempts to mislead investigators, attempts to control the narrative. Prosecutors would later argue that this case reflected precisely that sequence, but perhaps the most shocking discovery investigators made wasn't inside the storage unit. It was inside Corey Hill's past. As detectives expanded their background investigation, they uncovered a violent history stretching back decades, long before he became a businessman in Florida, long before church members knew him as Ambassador Corey. Long before he presented himself as a reformed family man, Corey Hill had already been convicted of a deadly act of violence. Court records revealed that in the early 1990s, he was convicted in Virginia for the fatal shooting of a man during a confrontation. He served a lengthy prison sentence before eventually being released. Investigators also uncovered additional assault-related cases from later years. Viewed together, the records painted a troubling picture, not of a single isolated incident, but of recurring violence across different periods of his life. To homicide investigators, prior violent behavior doesn't automatically predict future crimes. Most former offenders never commit homicide again. But when violence repeatedly appears across decades, especially involving firearms and interpersonal conflict, it becomes a critical factor in understanding risk. This revelation left many people asking the same question. How had someone with such a serious criminal history managed to build an entirely new identity? The answer wasn't simple. After serving his sentence, Corey relocated to Florida. He started a business, built new relationships, joined a faith community, presented himself as someone transformed by experience. For many who met him, that became the only version they ever knew. It serves as a powerful reminder that rehabilitation is possible for many offenders, but appearances alone can never substitute for accountability or ongoing assessment. In this case, prosecutors would later argue that the image Corey projected publicly was fundamentally at odds with the actions they allege he carried out privately. In January 2024, a grand jury formally indicted Corey Hill on multiple charges, including first-degree murder in connection with Shakira Rucker's death. Prosecutors announced their intent to seek the death penalty, arguing that the evidence suggested planning, deliberate concealment, and an exceptionally serious pattern of violent conduct. Corey Hill has remained in custody awaiting trial, and under the justice system, he is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in court. As of the time this documentary is being produced, the murder case has not yet reached a final verdict. That distinction matters. Our role on Crime Autopsy is to examine the evidence and the investigative process, not to replace the courts. For Shakira's family, however, one truth required no courtroom. She wasn't coming home. The woman whose greatest priorities were raising her children, building her business, and living her faith had become the victim at the center of one of Florida's most disturbing homicide investigations. But before this case comes to a close, there is one final question. Investigators, advocates, and families continue asking, could this tragedy have been prevented? Because sometimes, the most important evidence isn't found inside a crime scene. It's found in the warning signs that appeared long before the murder ever happened. Every homicide leaves behind evidence, fingerprints, phone records, surveillance footage, DNA. But after investigators finish collecting physical evidence, another kind of investigation begins, one that asks a much harder question. What happened long before the murder? Because in many domestic violence cases, the homicide itself isn't the beginning of the story. It's the final chapter. The warning signs often appear weeks, months, or even years earlier. Looking back at the death of Shakira Rucker, investigators and advocates would point to several moments where danger had already announced itself. Not quietly, but loudly. The affair had been exposed, the marriage had collapsed, threats had reportedly been made, a protective injunction had been granted. The relationship had entered a period that experts consistently identify as one of the highest risk stages for intimate partner homicide, the time immediately following separation. None of these warning signs guaranteed violence, but together they painted a picture of escalating risk. And tragically, that risk became reality. One of the most misunderstood aspects of abusive relationships is this. People often ask, why didn't she just leave? But they rarely ask, what happened after she did? Because leaving is not always the end of the danger. For many survivors, it's when the danger increases. According to domestic violence researchers, separation can represent the moment when an abusive partner feels they are losing control. For someone whose identity depends on dominance, rejection can become intolerable. Control becomes obsession. Obsession becomes retaliation. That doesn't happen in every abusive relationship, but when it does, the consequences can be devastating. By all publicly available accounts, Shakira did many of the things experts recommend. She separated. She found another place to live. She focused on her children. She rebuilt her independence. Those decisions required enormous courage, yet courage alone cannot always stop someone determined to commit violence. Then there is Angel Milligan. Her role in this case deserves careful reflection. She did something many people struggle to do. She told the truth. When she learned that Corey Hill was married, she chose not to remain silent. She contacted Shakira directly. She believed another woman deserved to know the truth. There was no way she could have known what would follow. According to investigators, after the affair was exposed, she became the target of alleged threats. Concerned for her safety, she sought legal protection through the courts. That protective injunction represented an important legal safeguard. But like many advocates have pointed out for years, a court order can establish legal consequences. It cannot physically stop someone already determined to ignore it. That's one of the most painful realities highlighted by this case. The law can create boundaries, but it cannot always prevent violence. The alleged shooting at Angel's home demonstrated that danger with heartbreaking clarity. Investigators say children were inside the house as gunfire struck the property. Those children survived. Angel survived. But survival does not erase trauma. Long after police leave, after reporters move on, after public attention fades, survivors are often left rebuilding lives forever changed by violence. Months after the incident, Angel publicly expressed disappointment that support quickly disappeared once the headlines faded. It's a reminder that surviving violence is not the end of someone's struggle. In many ways, it's the beginning of another. Meanwhile, prosecutors continued building their murder case against Corey Hill. Grand jury proceedings resulted in a first-degree murder indictment. Additional charges stemming from the alleged shooting of Angel Milligan remained part of the broader criminal case. Defense attorneys challenged certain evidence recovered during the investigation, including evidence from the storage unit. The court denied those motions, allowing prosecutors to move forward with the evidence collected. As of this recording, the criminal proceedings remain part of the judicial process, and no final verdict has yet been reached in the murder trial. That distinction is essential. In every criminal case, guilt must ultimately be determined in court based on admissible evidence and the applicable law. For Shakira's family, however, the legal process represents only one part of the story. Nothing can restore the birthdays missed, the school graduations she won't attend, the conversations her children will never again have with their mother. Justice, if achieved, may provide accountability, but it cannot replace a parent. It cannot repair childhood memories interrupted by violence, and it cannot erase grief. In the months following her death, Shakira's loved ones focused not only on mourning her loss, but also on honoring her life. Her family established a foundation dedicated to raising awareness about domestic violence and supporting women seeking safe transitions out of abusive relationships. That decision transformed unimaginable pain into purpose. It ensured that Shakira's name would become associated not only with tragedy, but with hope for others trying to escape dangerous situations. Sometimes the most meaningful legacy isn't found in how someone died. It's found in the lives their story continues to protect. There is another lesson buried inside this investigation, one that extends far beyond a single courtroom. Appearances can be profoundly misleading. Neighbors may see kindness. Friends may see generosity. Social media may display romance. Church communities may witness faith. None of those observations are necessarily false, but none of them reveal everything. Human beings are complicated, and some individuals become remarkably skilled at presenting different versions of themselves to different audiences. Investigators often refer to this as compartmentalization. Separate identities, separate relationships, separate realities, until eventually, those realities collide. Forensic investigations focus on physical evidence. Behavioral analysis focuses on patterns. When combined, they reveal something no single piece of evidence can explain alone. This case was never simply about one argument or one bad decision. According to prosecutors, it reflected an escalating pattern of deception, control, retaliation, and violence. A sequence investigators believe culminated in murder. Whether the courts ultimately agree will be determined through the legal process. But regardless of the verdict, one fact remains beyond dispute. 4 children lost their mother, a family lost a daughter, a community lost someone remembered for kindness, and another woman nearly lost her life after choosing honesty over silence. Cases like this challenge us because they refuse to offer simple answers. They remind us that violence often develops gradually, that warning signs deserve attention, that victims are not responsible for another person's choices, and that sometimes the people who appear safest on the outside may be hiding the darkest secrets. If Shakira Rucker's story teaches us anything, it's that the truth has value, even when speaking it carries enormous risk. Angel Milligan chose to tell the truth. Shakira chose to rebuild her life. Neither woman caused the violence that investigators allege followed. Responsibility for acts of violence always belongs to the person who commits them. As this case continues through the justice system, Crime Autopsy will continue following every significant development and examining the evidence with accuracy, fairness, and respect for the victims and their families. If you believe stories like this deserve thoughtful analysis instead of sensational headlines, subscribe to Crime Autopsy and join our community. Leave a comment below. Do you think stronger intervention systems could have changed the outcome of this case, or was the violence already set in motion? Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and remember, behind every case file is a human life that deserves to be remembered, not only for how it ended, but for how it was lived. Until next time, this is Crime Autopsy.